when you buy a house you live in versus a house that you don't live in and you rent it out to other people, they are two totally separate games with totally separate rules, basically, and how they work. And I guess there's two decisions that people have to make with housing, which is that, is it better for me to put more money into, say, ETFs versus buy an investment property and try and earn money that way through capital growth or rental income? And then the second question, which I guess is the one I'm trying to answer in my life, is do I rent forever and put more and more money into something like ETFs, or do I buy a house and then put whatever's left ETFs? I mean, let's start with primary place, because I guess for me, in terms of these different approaches, I have to kind of make this decision around, let's say I have $300,000 now, do I use it to get a mortgage and live in a home, or should I just rent, keep it all in ETFs, or buy more and more ETFs with it? And I don't know about you, but I feel like overwhelmed when I consider all these different things. Like, just to name some of them, how the capital gains tax is different on the house you live in versus ETFs. Stamp duty, that fee you pay the government for the, buying a house, comes into it. There's the leverage element. It's very expensive to get a loan for ETFs, but not for housing. There's three things to start. And then one I was thinking of when you were talking, which also blew my mind, I didn't realize this till a couple of years ago, is like, if I have a $3 million house when I retire, the government will give me a pension because they consider me broke, basically, right? But if I have a $3 million ETF portfolio and I'm renting, they look at me and they say, you're a rich person, you'll be fine by yourself. And it's so layered. I don't know if you had this experience, maybe I'm just fresh to it, but it just feels like there's so many variables being thrown around.
There is an absolute ton of variables. And I suppose that's what muddies the water, and that's what complicates the discussion a bit, and why these debates are had over and over again, and why there's seemingly no right answer to the question, because there are so many variables and it can be approached in so many different ways. It's interesting because there's that pension discussion, which I actually put a tweet out saying that you probably don't need a pension at some point, right? If you're living like multi-million dollar home and it's paid off, at some point there needs to be a cap, I think, on what level of house you're allowed to have, or what price it's allowed to be, before you can still get the pension. Because currently there's, unless I'm wrong somehow, there's basically no limit, right? Which is,
as far as I know, there's no limit.
It doesn't seem right. It seems like there should be a cap, and I don't know what the cap is. Maybe it's like you're allowed to have 1.5 or 2 times the median house price in Sydney or something like that, which is pretty generous still, right? And then after that, your pension kind of tapers off.
So how do you reconcile all those other elements, and the capital gains and the cheap leverage and stamp duty? How do you factor that into whether housing makes sense versus, say, ETF investing?
So when it's a home purchase, I would basically ignore the capital gains situation, because I see buying a home as I'm buying, it's almost like a lifestyle good, right? Instead of renting, I'm buying. I'm not thinking of it in terms of investment specific. So I'm not really taking into account the capital gains tax-free threshold, because if I sell that property and then go and move and buy another one, okay, great, it's capital gains free, but I've just moved house. Nothing magical has really happened.
You said that earlier, right? And as far as I understand it, you can kind of ignore it unless like a really specific use case might be, I go and buy a 4-bedroom family home. I grow into that home, and then in 20 years, I decide to sell it to live in like a 1-bedroom place with my partner. That downsizing, or you kind of describe it as moving cities as well. Like as a Sydney sider, you might go and buy a similar size house in Perth or Darwin or something. So if it's not like you plan to definitely significantly downsize or move to a cheaper city, as I understand it, you're saying you can mostly ignore the capital gain because you'll never really see that money manifest into your bank.
More or less, unless you are wanting to take that sort of an approach, because that kind of an approach can work, but it just depends if that's really what you want to do. If you want to max yourself out in terms of a mortgage to use the most absolute leverage you can get your hands on, you'll essentially at that point that'll become your primary investment. If this is your strategy that you're kind of focusing on, you'll basically just be pumping all of your available money into that house, because you've obviously gone and got yourself a very large mortgage and then you're planning to cash out later. So that can work. I'm not saying that can't work, but that's a very specific use case. And I don't think very many people do that. And then you're also very, very limited in terms of your flexibility and your lifestyle along the way, because you are forced to keep pumping all that money into that house. You're forced to keep up that large mortgage until you want to change that situation at some point in the future. But if you go the other way, where you've got a smaller mortgage and you've got cash surplus and you can pump that into a share portfolio or even into other properties or whatever you want to do, that's a much more flexible way and less restrictive way to go about it. So I think that's a very specific case.
That makes sense. And I think just for our listeners too, that capital gain thing we're talking about, if I go buy $1 million ETFs, I hold them for 20 years and that turns into $2 million ETFs. I have to pay tax on that $1 million that I gain. And it's typically at your income tax rate, but because you held it for so long, you get a 50% discount right now, which means that like roughly on $1 million gained, you'd pay about call it $200,000 of tax roundabout. But if your house goes from 1 million to 2 million, you pay no tax on that if you lived in it that whole time as the owner in that residence, right? So that's the kind of difference we're talking about when we ask that question.